Again, good evening, and it's always a pleasure to be here, even if it's in a virtual way. I enjoyed immensely my time in Sweden last time, and to see what kind of work you're doing also in Sweden for the Yiddish culture. So this is also inspiring me to be able to lecture both in Yiddish and English, and this is quite amazing that you're also really making it happen bilingually, and that there is an OILAM, the public for both. And I'm now sharing my presentation again, which hopefully Zoom will let me do. I think this is the one. Yeah, hopefully I can't see anything, but okay. Okay, so let's start it. There will be some slides in Yiddish. Oh no, why is it not? Okay, I know. I'm sorry again. I'll simply start from the beginning. Yeah. So that the topic of my lecture today is Rachel Auerbach, Rachel. Now, when we're not talking Yiddish, she was Rochel actually in Yiddish. I should have said that. She spoke, southeastern Yiddish, not the Klal Yiddish I was speaking. So Rochel, Rachela, Rachel Auerbach, and the Galician Yiddishism. But first of all, I would like to tell you quickly who she was. And it's not possible to tell you the ganze Torah auf ein Fuß, the whole Torah standing on one foot, but I will try to do the impossible. She's best known for her role, if she's known, that's one thing, for her role as in the Ringelblum archive. She was one of the three surviving members of the clandestine ghetto archive, known better as the Ringelblum archive today, and the group had its code name, which is Oinek Shabbos or Onek Shabbat, depending on the pronunciation. But and she's appreciated for her work for the archive and for her work on the Holocaust history. But she, for a long, very, very long time, she was invisible. These are a few quotes for important historians dealing with the Holocaust history and literature, or Yiddish literature, like Ruth Weiss, who talk about Auerbach. And it's important also to mention that she was the head of the Yad Vashem's witness accounts department, and she developed actually a methodology of oral history in her own way. She was not the one that really created it, but she was developing it, and inspired also by the American oral history movement. She was, and this is part of the reason why she was invisible, one of the very few women who were active in the field of Holocaust research in the immediate post-war era. She was instrumental, but again invisible, when it comes to the preparation of the Eichmann trial, and she was involved really in many very important discussions about the Holocaust history, Holocaust memory, and Polish anti-Semitism. Also something that is called Treblinka affair that I didn't mention in Yiddish, which is a major debate that took place in France about the Holocaust memory. So really an important person, and for a long time totally invisible. She's coming back to the public sphere. Here you have a few examples coming mainly from Poland, but not only. It's understandable because her works were first published, not in full, but really her most important works right now are available in Polish, both in the original, because she was bilingual, and in translation from Yiddish. So that's why there is more in Poland than in other places, but she's gradually becoming more and more interesting for the international public. Here, a mural in Warsaw, here a theater monodram with Jowita Budnik. I'm still thinking in Yiddish, I'm sorry. A Polish novel by a contemporary writer who got inspired by Auerbach. And now I can tell you that we attended the very same seminar by Professor Jacek Laociak, when we were for the first time reading from the manuscript copies of Auerbach's diary when I was first-year student, together with Sylvia in the same class. And well, I got to edit her Goethe works later on, and Sylvia wrote a novel inspired by Auerbach's language. Well, to show you that things are happening and it's a process. So here in 2015, there was an exhibition in the German Historical Museum devoted to the year 1945, and Auerbach was one of the 3 people who were telling the story of the year in Poland. It's very interesting, and also approach. One person was a photographer and a refugee coming from an Armenian Polish family. The second one was a Yiddishist activist, and the third one was a politician and later prime minister to be Józef Tyrankiewicz. Very interesting approach of the curators. But now she's really getting more and more space in the public sphere on the international level. Well, the main thing is that there are very few texts of her available in English, which is the international language, but this will soon change. Here is Roberta Grossman's movie, Who Will Tell Our History? And you see Jovita Budnik already, the one that I showed you earlier on. And Grossman made Auerbach one of the main heroes of the movie, even though she was not so important for the archive. She was not the central person in the archive, but she's central for Grossman, who tells her story. Now there is a film coming out, a French movie coming out in November by Raphael Lewandowski. The premiere takes place next month in Mémorial de la Shoah in Paris. So, and then it will be available in the movie theaters. And it's telling the story about the uprising, and the occasion is the anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. But the approach of the director is different. So he places Auerbach, and those of you who were listening to our Q&A about the Eichmann trial, it's interesting here because he places Auerbach next to Sylvia Lubetkin, so the ghetto fighter. And he tells the story of the resistance from both civil and armed resistance perspective. So that's where Auerbach will be visible again. Here you see her as a cover girl in 1975, and you see that this comes from her, the photo comes from a document, her Ausweis, work Ausweis, that she used on the so-called Aryan side. And you see how important this part of her biography was for her. It was a defining moment, and it defined her as a person. And this is something I haven't said in Yiddish. I realize now when I was talking about this moment, she herself renounced her private life, family life, so to speak. And she would say that I am a woman pregnant, but I'm not pregnant with the future life, so with the child, but I'm pregnant with the past. And my job is to give birth to this past, so secure this past so she felt like she had a very interesting approach to the documents, her own documents and documents in general, documenting the Holocaust. And she looked at them as a mother looks at her children. But important how much, I mean, I don't have to explain it why this part of her life was so important and life defining, but it defined her job, so her professional life, and also her private life, and her decision that she doesn't have the right to have a private life, that the whole life is about this moment and documenting and finding the right way to tell the story. And this is something very incredible. So quick, terrible slide with all the dates that you don't want to hear about now. So I'm going to write, talk about it quickly. She was born in 1899, and many sources will tell you a different thing. I really based my research on documents, primary documents, and so please trust me that she was born in 1899. I'm trying to convince many different libraries and encyclopedias to change the date. for the time being. You have to believe me. It's documented in my book, so the sources are there. She was born in a village that is called Lanivci in Ukrainian, Wanovce in Polish, Lanowice in Yiddish, in Podolia, in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, in a Yiddish-speaking family, of village Jews. This is unusual. So she was surrounded by Polish and Ukrainian neighbors, and she spoke Polish. She was bilingual. She knew some Ukrainian as well. During the war, she wasn't able to finish the gymnasium and to graduate. She did it late in 1920, and then 21. So she came late to the university and started her studies at the Jan Kazimierz University in Lemberg, Lwów, at that time in the Second Polish Republic, majoring in philosophy, which meant a different thing that we think today. So she was specializing in psychology and pedagogy. And she was also interested in history, social history mainly. She was active as a Zionist activist in student circles, and she was an activist of the Keren Kayemet LeIsrael. And her first article was in Polish. She's not telling this story in her later memoirs, but she published simply an article supporting the case of Keren Kayemet LeIsrael. And it was problematic for her that she published it in Polish, and she tried then to somehow explain why she was writing in Polish. She said that she was forced to do it, and it's true, because at that time she had to become a freelance journalist because you had to pay for the studies in the interwar period. And her father died, so she had to support herself. And her mother had died earlier. So she simply had to publish as much as possible in both Yiddish and Polish. Sometimes she was publishing the same article in different places, in Yiddish and Polish 3 times in different journals or newspapers. This is how she was able to support herself. But it's not the full story. Polish was her language, and but for ideological reasons, for her own cultural and political agenda, but I'm thinking about politics in a very broad sense, she chose Yiddish. For her, Yiddish was the source of modern Jewish national identity. And she came to understand that as a Zionist activist. So she was witnessing something that in Galicia was a social process that was perhaps, it was happening in whole Poland, but in Galicia it was more visible, and because it had the longer in the Polish independence story. So Galicia was an autonomous region in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Polish was strong in Galicia. So Jews were assimilating either to the German or to the Polish culture, and in cities such as Lwów, Lemberg, or Kraków, it was the Polish culture that was attractive. And also the Zionist politics in Galicia was in Polish. Of course, there were meetings, there were groups that were speaking Hebrew, but Polish was defining the political agenda, the discourse of Zionist politics in Galicia. So she came to understand that actually the use of Polish is threatening the existence of Jewish culture in the diaspora, but also the future of the Jewish nation in general. So she started to be involved in many Yiddishist projects, including the famous Jewish Scientific Institute, or actually, as it was called in English in the pre-war times, Yiddish Scientific Institute, the YIVO. And she was involved in the project that I'm going to speak about shortly, which became a failure. She moved to Warsaw, the capital of the Polish Republic, but also one of the biggest European center, except for Russia, when it comes to Yiddish culture, and next after New York. She continued her work as a translator, journalist, and Yiddishist activist in Warsaw, tried to resume her studies in Warsaw, but because of the financial problems wasn't able to do that. And when the war broke out, when the war started, she wanted to join her family in Galicia. At that time, it wasn't clear that it would be the Soviet occupation zone. This is this time when it's a gray zone. But she wanted to join her family. Her parents had died before the war, as did her brother, but her sister-in-law and her children were in Lviv. But Ringelblum summoned her and told her, as she's telling the story, that not everybody can allow themselves to leave, and that the intelligentsia has really obligations toward the nation. And as a member of the intelligentsia, engaged intelligentsia, she is somebody who should stay. And she stayed. And she was entrusted the task of running a soup kitchen in the ghetto, which she did. She was an amazing organizer. So I'm not surprised that Ringelblum entrusted this task to her. It didn't mean that she was already working for the ghetto archive. It came later from 1940 on until she left the ghetto in March 1943. Then she continued the work of documentation work as a member of the Jewish National Committee that was led by Dr. Adolf Berman, and I mean, on the Aryan side. This is a more complex organization. I have to already mention this. And she survived the war. She didn't have to hide. She had so-called good looks. But again, even good looks couldn't secure, no life threat on the Aryan side, and she knew that, and she had to change, for example, apartments, and some periodically she had to hide, but generally she went as a Pole on the Aryan side. After the war, she became a collaborator of the Central Jewish Historical Commission that was transferred to what we know today as the Jewish Historical Institute from 1947 on. Continued her work on documentation, and taking witness accounts, and supporting the Yiddish culture, the development of Yiddish culture in post-war Poland, but the communist regime and also the limitations that were put on the Jewish life, that in the post-war period, immediate post-war period, the few first years, even with all the pogroms and all the anti-Jewish violence that was happening in post-war Poland, still, when it comes to Jewish life, it was quite varied. There were different organizations, different media outlets. So there was some hope. She wrote a very sharp article about post-war Polish anti-Semitism, by the way. Again, a chapter for itself. And there's so much to say about her. And disappointed with what was happening in post-war Poland. She said in a given moment, it's simply, anti-Semitism is your problem, Poles, and simply, there's no sense in dealing with it. I'm just going. She also felt very lonely. Many people had left before, and she decided to go to Israel. It was not her first choice, but she never regretted. I mean, that's what she says. She wanted to go to France, to the US, but decided to go to Israel and never regretted this decision. There, she continued her work as a freelance journalist. This is, like coming back periodically in her life until she was hired by the Yad Vashem Institute, and she was the person who created the testimony division, witness testimony testimony division in the Yad Vashem Institute, and was the person who helped from behind the scenes to prepare the Eichmann trial. She died lonely. This is also amazing. I mean, this amazing person who achieved so much died lonely of cancer, of breast cancer, in Israel in 1976. Here you see her books. These are in Yiddish and Hebrew. She started with a reportage in books, which means not hundreds or thousands of different pieces that she published. With a reportage about the history of the death camp in Treblinka, and also what was happening there after the war, so the looting that took place in Treblinka by the local population, a work devoted to the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, then also a publication about the reckoning of with the German people, and her unwillingness to accept what was happening, like the acceptance of German reparations, for example. She would never do anything that had to do with Germans or German money, reparation money. She'd never. So, for example, if you look at the lexicon of modern Yiddish writers, you won't find her name because it was financed by the reparation for money. So that's why she refused to be published, for her biography to be published there. This is a Hebrew edition of her ghetto writings, and then the Hebrew edition of her work on the uprising, a series of reportages about Israel, and then her opus magnum, so work that she was really writing and rewriting her whole life, called Warszawa Wercevoes, that tells the story of what happened in Warsaw in the ghetto. So here you see this nice student before the war, and this is just after the war, a photo taken right after the war. And the period between the two is perhaps 11, 12 years. Okay, the cause of Yiddish. I have to change the languages. So the cause of Yiddish in Galicia, why she was involved in Galicia with Yiddish culture. Well, the fact is that Galicia was not a very well-known center of Yiddish culture on the world scale. It was called the cursed verscholtene Assimilatieland, the cursed land of assimilation, and not considered an important place on the Yiddishist map. So Auerbach, understanding and being convinced that Yiddish is essential for the Jewish survival of Jews as a nation, and for Jewish culture as a distinct culture, started to be involved in a project that was to counter different social processes ongoing in Galicia that were going on also in different parts of Poland, but they were more visible in Galicia. And the assimilation, or what we call today acculturation, and integration, but that meant sometimes also national conversion, were problems that she dealt with. So she tried, for example, to convince different writers who did not know Yiddish to start writing in Yiddish. She was partly successful, as with a writer that is really important also for the Jewish history of Stockholm, the niece of Rabbi Marcus Ehrenpreis, Deborah Dvoire Vogel, who was her close friend from the university, and she helped her even translate her early works into Yiddish. Vogel came from a Zionist family. She spoke Polish, Hebrew, German, but not Yiddish. So Auerbach was one person who was helping her transition to the Yiddish culture, partly successful because most of Vogel's incredibly interesting works were written in Yiddish, not in Polish, not in Hebrew, though there are Polish and Hebrew works too. She wasn't so successful with Bruno Schulz, and in a letter to him, she says, okay, if you cannot belong to the Jewish culture, please belong to the word, not to the Polish culture, to the word. So this was her idea. And she kept doing this also after the war, trying to convince many writers to write in Yiddish. And in her opus magnum that I mentioned, she's mentioning a very, very talented Jewish young researcher, Menachem Linder, who was murdered in the first terror action in the ghetto in April 1942. And she's thinking about the similarities between their faiths. He was also a Zionist, coming also from the Galician milieu, involved in the student Zionist circles. And he also became, disappointed with the local Zionism and with their approach to the language question. So their actually approach to Yiddish, that they deemed a jargon that should be replaced by Hebrew. Her approach was that Hebrew culture should be developed, but it's the Yiddish that really is instrumental for the future of the Jewish nation. She wrote an article, supposedly the Zionist Yiddishist misunderstanding, which is not true, but I will tell you in a second about it. And as herself, Linder started to somehow move away from the Zionist circles. He was disappointed because they were only, the slogan was Ivrit to Polanit, so modern Hebrew or Polish, and which she calls a convenient legitimation of the ongoing assimilation, actually. And because they were denying actually the function of Yiddish in preserving Jewish national identity. The article was called Yehuda's Selbstverachtung, and then a chapter of the ideological perversion. So she's saying that the Zionist movement, that is a national movement, is actually, like rejecting something that is essential for Jewish national culture. And she's convinced that there are some Zionists that think differently, including Ringelblum, whom she knew later on. But she says, well, you're silent. Why are you silent? And she's asking very important questions in this article that remain unanswered. So she comes with her own answer in collaboration, of course, in cooperation with many other writers. This is an advertisement, press advertisement for a literary evening that is trying to show something more. It's not just about reading works, nice poems in Yiddish. It's about proving that Galicia is the land, das Land, of Yiddish creativity. This is something totally different. This is super performative. Because through, like an orchestrating different events and publications, she, with the milieu of young writers that you see here on the photo here, in English, with an English caption, she's trying to really establish Lemberg and Galicia on the map of modern Yiddish culture and modern Yiddishism. Here you see David Königsberg, Hanne Seinfeld, who was the wife of a very important Yivo activist, and somebody who was also supporting Yivo financially, Avram Seinfeld, who was killed during the Holocaust. This is Auerbach, together with the poet Itzik Manger and her nephew Mundek, who also perished in the Holocaust. This is Nusia Imber, the wife of Yiddish and Polish poet Shmuel Yankev Imber, the nephew of the author of the Israeli national anthem Hatikva. Here, a leftist writer, Israel Ashendorf, Ber Horowitz, and communist-leaning writer Yankev Shudrich here. This is 1937. Auerbach was already not in Lemberg, Lvov at that time. And who is missing from the picture is her close friend that I mentioned earlier. So Dvoira Fogel was at that time also very disappointed with the prospects of Yiddish called modern, highly intellectual Yiddish culture in Galicia. She wrote to Bruno Schulz that, well, people who come for readings of my works in Yiddish either do not understand the ideas because they're not expecting this from the Yiddish culture, or they do not understand the language because they're so acculturated and are unable to understand it already. So she's super disappointed. Here is a journal that she published. I mean, Auerbach, together with Fogel, they were behind the two most important intellectual contributors to this project were them. And here you see the editorial coming from us, von uns, oder fin ins, as they would say in Galicia. We are starting from the beginning. We are building ourselves into the fortress wall of the Jewish world in Galicia. So they're using this fortress, the military language. They are fighting for the future of Yiddish culture in Galicia. And if what happened to each foundation happens to us, if we are unnoticed, and if on those foundations a strong, impressive structure rises, we will accept this fate with humility. We wish to become the liberated word of our region, a great edifice of all that embraces the whole mankind, the intimate treasury of what is universally Jewish. We wish to offer our contribution from our contribution, this is the title actually of the journal, to Steyr, from our corner of the world. So they want to contribute to the general, it's interesting how they form it, to the general culture and also to the Jewish culture. And this is the perspective they have, and they're ready to sacrifice themselves. So it's not about them, it's about the future. And also you see that for everything, for all that is important, so they're trying to create a platform that is non-partisan. And Auerbach is fighting for this non-partisan approach, but the political discussions that are really happening in the 1930s, and really the cultural world becomes more and more politicized, the Yiddish cultural world, not only the Yiddish cultural world, but we're focusing here on the Yiddish history. And it's impossible really to avoid like straightforward politics. People involved in this project have different political views, and the project collapses because of the political differences, but also because of the financial situation. They do not have money to publish the journal, and because of the lack of interest among the public. They are trying to do something to somehow, this is the resolution of the Congress of Jewish Writers in Galicia. Here you see a leaflet that was published called Yiddish, that was actually diagnosing the situation that the intelligentsia becomes more and more assimilated. The article included in this leaflet or this publication was also by a Yiddish Polish historian Jan Kiewszacki, who is talking about the fate of the Jewish intelligentsia and its history and its also its obligations. So the hope is there in the late 1920s and the 1930s. They're understanding also that they need to make it available to the broader public, that few people, I mean, we know that today as well, will read a very intellectual journal, but a daily is something different. So they convinced the editors of an important Yiddish daily in Lemberg, Lviv, to give them space. That was actually a feature to the main daily called Literatur und Kunst. It was a Shabbos feature, and it was edited by a separate group. So the group that was actually led by Auerbach and her husband Ber Schnapper, a Yiddish Galician poet. They divorced later on. And this was a very intellectual feature, but at the same time, the language used was popular. So this was what they called cultural propaganda for those who were not interested entirely in the modern Yiddish literature and culture, and for those who were going away looking for inspiration in German or Polish. So they were trying to show how important and Yiddish is, and they were also trying to educate the public, the popular public, about the importance of high culture, and also to diagnose the situation. Here you have different reviews and different publications different articles that were published. I'm not going to speak about all of them because I'm running out of time. Part of the problem, I mentioned political differences, I mentioned financial problems, but part of the problem was also the fact that this was a woman that was standing behind that, even the whole project, even though she was supported by different men, but still it was deemed a female endeavor, and probably part of the reasons of its failure was also the fact that it was Auerbach and not a male leader that was leading the project. I'm not sure how much time I have, but to sum it up, so there was a short period of this kind of mobilization of young Yiddish writers that were migrating mainly out of Galicia to be with the public, that wanted to hear them, wanted to read them. The direction was Warsaw or New York, for example. But because of it was a failure, Auerbach left for Warsaw together with other Galician artists and writers, Nuchim Bomze, Mendel Reif, a painter, a graphic artist. So this was a broader movement, the broader exodus of Galician intellectuals towards greater centers of Yiddish culture. She remained in Warsaw, as I told you, and here you see some documents that she produced during the ghetto time. I told you that she started to be involved with the group later on. She was not very central in the earlier period. so in the early 1940s. This is the first actually page of her diary that she wrote in the ghetto, written in Polish. Here she tried to get rid of a part of her writing that is concerning intimate issues. She did it after the war, something you should not do to the documents, but she did it. And it's a very fascinating story for itself, and for another lecture. But I wanted to show you also the state of the documents that were preserved in the Ringelblum archive in two parts. This is the first so-called part discovered in 1946. This is the second part discovered also later in 1950. Sometimes they're fully legible or almost fully legible. Sometimes they're illegible or hardly legible. And I based my edition on 3 years of work with those documents. But the technology actually gives us hope that we can read more and more. So, for example, right now, after we simply were able to work with the scans with a different technology, I can read more than I was able to read almost 10 years ago. So this is also helpful. We have also Yiddish works here. This is what I call notes to the monograph of the soup kitchen that she ran. This was written in Yiddish in the framework of a research project conducted by the Ringelblum group in the ghetto, and trying to document the fate of the Jews during the occupation. At that time, it was not clear that this is documenting the annihilation of the Jewish people, not yet. But here we see a document of time. So she was rewriting her monograph when the Großaktion, the liquidation action of the Warsaw Ghetto, started in July 1942, and she wrote something that she herself also called a mean. That's not English, that's Yiddish. A sort of testament, last will, and her last will is nekoma, revenge. And she says that she's ready, to do everything to survive, to kiss the, I'm still thinking English, to kiss the boots of the worst scoundrel just to survive, to live to the moment of liberation, and to take revenge. And this word revenge is repeated in this short document again and again. This part is really hardly legible, but as I told you, thanks to the technology, we see more. After the liquidation action of 1942, Auerbach was one of the very few members of the Ringelblum archive that survived in the ghetto. So she became more instrumental, and she was entrusted the task of interviewing the escapees from the Treblinka camp. And this is what you see. Here it says Treblinki. This was how people called it. It was not an unknown place at that time, becoming known gradually. And she was interviewing Jakub Krzepicki, who escaped Treblinka after 18 days there. And this is over 100 page long as a testimony that was prefaced by Auerbach's attempt to understand what actually Treblinka was, to understand the phenomenon of what she called Mordbetrieb, so simply the death factory. A lot of notes, a lot of erasures, a lot of corrections. This is a very complex document and a very important one. Here, he did not survive the war. He came back to the ghetto and participated in the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, and simply died in fighting. Here you see Auerbach together with one of the secretaries of the Ringelblum archive, Herr Schwasser, who survived the war together with his wife, another member of the Oynek Shabbos group, Luma Wasser. Auerbach was not in Warsaw when the archive was discovered in September 1946. She was in Łódź, living there. but she came to Warsaw next day. So these are shots from the movie, which I didn't mention in the Yiddish part. So now I'm mentioning this to you. And this was also an important, I mean, Auerbach's role in discovering the archive. I mean, Wasser's role was also important, but at that time, survivors who were traumatized, I mean, didn't understand exactly why it's important to organize a search action for papers. There were more important things, and it's natural. I'm not judging it. Please understand me. You know, psychological help, food, places to stay, many other things that were simply basic needs of the survivors, and why papers. So Auerbach understood both, and she was really urging people to do this, to organize the search for the archive, because she believed that this is a national treasure. And I'm sorry, I don't have an English translation of an article by Mendelmann, who was remembering how Auerbach, how she was strong, how she was urging and shouting and saying that this is not a fantasy, that this is something that that is a national treasure, and without it, it's impossible to think about the future of the Jewish memory. And she's saying, I will not, really rest until it's found. I will not let you rest. And she was the kind of stubborn person that would do it. She was a super stubborn person, and not always a nice one. But this is part of her achievement. She was really goal-oriented and going towards her goal, and understanding that this is something that will define the way we understand the history of the Holocaust, something that is very clear to us today, something that was not clear at the beginnings of the Holocaust research, that was, based on the perpetrators produced documents, that the time where historians had little trust for witnesses and for witness testimonies. And we went through a whole process to understand how important these documents are, and how important the approach of the Ringelblum group and the Oinek Shabbos group was for understanding the history of the Churban, as we call it in Yiddish, or the Umkom, as also Auerbach called it. This is the first Yiddish word used for destruction, for a Holocaust. So thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer your questions. And I'm sorry this is such a run through a very complex and very fascinating life, but I wanted to speak about her pre-war engagements, because she was a whole person, and it's good to have a whole picture of a person who was so much defined, as many others were, of course, by what happened during the war and the Holocaust. Dank.
Herzlichen Dank.